Alright, I know it's been a little while, but I like to bring in the 2020s properly and show off one of the latest products I've been working on. So, this is going to be a demonstration overview video for my latest Nifty Shifter JR version 1.1. So for those of you that don't know, this is a pass-through manual shift controller for the AW-4 Jeep automatic transmissions. And what this lets you do is take manual control of your auto transmission so that you can shift into gears manually and hold gears. You can control the torque converter, and you can do it all with the factory shifter, or you can use custom buttons, shifters, and other doodads, all while keeping the check engine light happy if you have one of those, and keeping you at a limp mode. So yeah, it's a lot of fun, and I'd like to show it off today. So let's talk about the basics. What makes this different from other shift controllers and, shifters out on the market? You've probably seen tons of them. Pretty popular ones like Rad Designs or Montana Fab, or, any other place you can think of. So what makes this any different? There's not even a shifter. This is the first plug-and-play shifter that I've ever seen. This will interface directly into your factory wiring. Doesn't require any splicing, but that feature might not be around forever. These things are a pain in the butt to build. The other thing is, this is the only shifter that I know of that will give you engine braking in all gears. There's a bit of a caveat to that, but I'll explain that later when we get to how the transmission works. Engine braking is extremely important if you're going to use this off-road. If you're trying to go down a very steep hill, you'd have to be really riding your brakes if you were in drive. But if you throw this in first, you're going to have engine braking in first, and then the car will do the crawling for you. You won't even have to touch the brakes. You'll just gently glide right down like it was nothing. It is a huge, huge benefit to have engine braking in all gears off-road if you're doing some very technical stuff. So that is the main breadwinner there. If you guys like additions, this does come with an optional switch and a display so you can see what gear you're in. Not a lot of people have both shifter and gear setups. So if you'd like to see your gear and your torque converter, this will cover you. And if we pop open the cover, there's actually quite a lot under the hood here. Don't mind the bodge diodes. That was just part of the prototype batch of fixing some issues. But there's a lot of logic going on here. This will prevent the check engine light from coming on and keep you at a limp mode, so you can seamlessly switch between auto and manual on the fly. You don't have to turn the key off or anything like that. Won't be any issues at all. There's also a couple different logic modes in here, so you've got more than one way to shift your transmission. So this is I've been trying to work on a very all-in-one, very inclusive, everything, everybody gets some way to do it. The juniors are a little lower on the totem pole because it's just a couple manual options just to keep prices down and keep things simple. But anyway, that is pretty much the Nifty Shifter JR in a nutshell. So let's get into some specifics. So we got a nice long instruction manual if you want to learn how everything works, but I'll let you read that if you like. On the back, it shows you how to set up for every mode. So you have your factory shifter mode or your custom mode, and there's tons of little options and stuff. So on the device itself, this will plug into your factory transmission computer. So on the older models, the Gen 1 Cherokees, this is 87 to 96. Back here behind this panel, take out all these little screws, and you'll find your transmission computer. You'll unplug that and put the device in between there. For you 97 and up guys, your computer will be over here on this wall, up under the dash a little bit. So then you'll find yours there. So this will plug in between your factory computer, and by wiring up a master auto manual switch, we can turn the device on or off whenever we want. So this is shift on the fly too. If we're driving, you can turn this on and off whenever you want. So in essence, the Nifty Shifter JR is a manual shift controller. There's no fancy logic, so there's no sequential or automatic shifting or anything. This is purely manual, so you have to put it in every single gear that you want. So let's go over the device. We've got a jack back here for an optional screen. So I have 1-inch and 2-inch 7-segment single-digit displays. This is our 1-inch display with optional switch, which we'll get to later, as well as a light. And they come with mounting frames. So this is a gauge pod mount, so you can slide it into a gauge pod. And we've also got a flush mount, so you can drill it and screw it down or pop it into place wherever you want. So we can see what gear we're in, and the decimal point down there shows you torque converter. Down here we've got some switches to select the settings for the device. So we have the shift mode, whether it uses the factory shifter. So 2 dots is on, 1 dot is off. So if you want your factory shifter on, we'll set it like that. If you want it in custom mode, we set it like this. Next one is for the power comfort switch, for people that do or don't have that. Back here is your power comfort switch for the transmission. Most people probably just leave it in power, but we can use that as the manual switch. We need a way to enter into the manual mode through the switch. That is the most important part of this, is to flip the manual switch on to activate the device. So we can actually use the power comfort switch for that by setting that on. So when you push it into power mode, it's manual, so the light's on. And in comfort mode, this will flip the circuitry so that the TCU is still in power mode. So you don't have to worry about comfort mode. If you do need comfort instead, let me know and I might be able to do some wiring for you. But I figured power would be the most common option. And the other one down here is for the torque converter. So this is the lockup. This helps bring down your RPMs on the highway and get you better fuel economy. If you leave it like this, they're separate. So when you're in auto, the TCU does it. When you're in manual, only you do it. When you switch it to combo, you can actually turn the torque converter on and off at any time, and the computer can also turn it on and off at any time. So it's kind of a shared thing. You could leave that on if you want to see if the computer turns it on when it feels appropriate. But those are some of the options. Now, we have a big header over here. This is where all the magic happens for wiring everything. So you'll get this ribbon cable right here. This is a 10-pin ribbon cable with a bunch of connections. And this will let you wire up whatever shifter you would like and setting some of the different modes. So over here we can see all our stuff. Like we've got a 12 volt and ground for turning things on and off. And then all these are inputs for switches. So the manual mode switch is the big one. This puts it into manual mode. You need this one at the very least. If you're doing custom, you can choose any of the gears, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you're in the factory shifter mode, we have an overdrive mode, which I'll show later. We have torque converter. Gray is an override for the manual, which is a really fun one we'll get to. And this one is our screen. So if you choose this option, it'll run into the device and come out on the white pin. And then you can wire the white pin to any of those inputs so that this switch does whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. But I would assume the most common option for this would be the manual mode. So you can wire the white to, I believe, the brown? Yeah, white to brown, and then your switch activates manual mode. So that's the basics. Alright, enough yammering. Let's see this thing in action. So, to install this, it's just a snap. Now, I'd recommend taking this whole panel off, but I'm in and out of this thing quite a lot. But this might even be a one-hander here. So, first we should set our switches while we can still see them. So I'm going to show you guys shifter mode first. Okay, so we've got shifter mode set. I'm going to show you power comfort mode. So that is set. And we'll leave the torque converter normal for now. So those are all set. So now we can flip this over and plug this bad boy in. Okay, we'll go underneath and plug the other side. Let's try the hand on the dash up. Look at that. One-hander install with a camera. Tell me that's not easy. Painless. And our optional display is also a simple snap away. So we will plug that in. There you go. And screen's in place. Cool. Alright. So at the bare minimum, this is really all you need to get you going. So let me show you around the factory shifter mode and the bread and butter of what this thing can really do. Alright, so before we dive in too deep, I want to give you guys a quick lesson on the AW-4 transmission and how it works. So right now, we have an electronic shift controller, okay? Keyword being electronic. There's still a very mechanical part of this transmission that no shifter is going to get around. This guy has to stay here no matter what. You can put a different handle on it or have a different system, but something has to physically connect to that shift linkage underneath here to make this work. So any kind of electronic only shifter only controls forward gears. No ands, if, or buts about it. If that shift linkage isn't being moved, all you got is forward gears. So let's say we put this into our manual mode or do whatever we want. Park, reverse, and neutral are all controlled by the shifter. This guy here. If you want reverse, it's reverse. You want neutral or park, you have to move this guy. So this is kind of a benefit for us, because what that means is if we're in drive over here and we put this into manual mode and you got to go to reverse, no matter what gear you pick, you could put this into first, second, third, fourth, doesn't matter. This will override that command and it will be in reverse no matter what. That's just how the transmission works. That is a manual override that can't be changed electronically. So no matter what's going on with your electronics, you can always throw it in whatever you want. So for the purposes of this shifter, anything the shifter, this shift controller can do is in drive, drive third, or drive 1, 2. Okay? So that's all that manual mode does, is it changes your forward gears. Anything else is totally manual. Now, a couple other things. For our forward gears, there are a couple of different things, which is labeled down here. So we have a limit on our available gears in each mode, as well as the engine braking in each mode. So if you notice, in drive, we can get every single gear. As we start to drop down, we start losing the higher end. So in D3, you can't pick fourth. Like, you could shift into fourth. If you got a joystick that you connect, you can push fourth if you want. It's going to mechanically go into third. There's nothing you can do electronically. Like I'm saying, this is like a mechanical override. This is the bread and butter. This is very important for the more interesting features of the transmission. So as you move this down, you have less gears to pick from. And if you try to electrically pick a higher gear, it'll mechanically be limited to the highest available gear. It's just how it works. So now, that important thing I was telling you about, engine braking, this is the fancy stuff right here. This is fun for off-roading and deceleration. Okay, so this is what slows you down. Obviously, when you hit the gas, you speed up, but when you let off, if you don't have engine braking, you kind of just free spin, you coast. The engine doesn't slow you down. If you're used to driving a manual transmission, you know when you speed up you go, and when you let down you slow. You don't have to use the brake the whole time. You can just kind of let the engine slow you down. Well, that's what engine braking is. And we only have that in a couple different things. So in drive, you have 4 and 3, but that's it. So first and second, that's where you're going to be in off-road, and you're missing all that. So you got to move the shifter down to third or first, second, depending on what you want to do. So, if you have to move the shifter to get engine braking anyway, why not use this as your manual controller? See where we're coming from now? So that's why this device, the Nifty Shifter, is special, because it's the only one I know of that uses the factory shifter, so you can gain all the capabilities of the factory transmission. And a small side note for people saying, oh, well, you could use the torque converter. Think about this for a little bit. So the torque converter is only part of the way that the transmission works. So the torque converter is kind of like an in-between man for the engine and the transmission. So in normal driving, it's a torque multiplier. The way that all this mechanical stuff works is through internal clutches and things. So inside the transmission, this is after the torque converter. So say like you're like, oh, you know, if you lock the torque converter in first and drive, you'll definitely be able to slow down, right? Well, yeah, it's locking the engine and the transmission part, but the part after that, the clutches that connect the input to the output, that's the part that's slipping. It's inside the transmission itself. So not even the torque converter can override these mechanical clutches. So no matter what, you're kind of stuck with this guy. So now that we got that part out of the way, you understand how the transmission works, now we can see what we can actually do with it. Alright, so if we flip this bad boy over, first we will look at factory shifter mode. So our manual mode, this is how we enter manual. We can either wire up a switch through this guy, or if you have the power comfort switch, we can set it to that. So we are setting it to on, which is 2 dots. And our factory shifter mode has been set on that switch as well, so that's 2 dots on there. So for gear selection, we just move the shifter. That's all we got to do. So D4 is third, D3 is second, and D1, 2 is first. Pretty simple. Well, you're asking, oh, well, how do you get fourth gear? Well, that is where the overdrive input is for. The purple wire, I think that said. So what we do is we provide 12 volts to purple. So the way this works, you have 12 volts going through a switch into our input, and that's all supplied on here. So our red wire is our 12 volt, and it's fused, so you can't blow anything up. And I think purple was 4th. So you would wire 12 volt into a switch, and then the switch goes out to purple. So you're turning purple on and off for overdrive mode, but I'll show you that later. Torque converter is also optional, where we can set that torque converter switch so that they kind of both work together with the TCU and the switch, or wire it to a switch just like we talked about for the overdrive. But again, none of that's really important, so let's just look at the basics. So here we are in auto mode with the power comfort switch. So comfort is now power, and power, if I can show you this display, power is manual. So see how that just changed? This is our new gear. So we are currently in drive. Sorry everything's so far away, but this is drive, this is D3, and this is D1. So no matter how fast you go, what you're doing, this will always be the gear you're in. Now, the smart guys there, if you notice, in between, if I hold this in between first and second, it hits third. Now the reason for that is because this works off your neutral safety switch. So if you don't have a working or a properly adjusted neutral safety switch, this mode will not work for you. But you'll also have weird shifting in auto mode anyway, so it's good to have a neutral safety switch that works. Now, a fun fact, the drive position on the older models, drive isn't an input. Drive doesn't exist. All that the transmission knows is, are you in third or are you in first, second? If you're not in any of these two, it will just guess that you're in drive. So when we're in between these, it thinks you're in drive. So just make sure you're adjusted and just, shift a little quick. That's the only downfall I can think of with the Junior. There's nothing I can do. If you're in between inputs, it can't tell the difference. So just, when you're shifting, just be firm about it. It's fast enough that you won't notice it unless you're really hanging around in there. But besides that, that is your first, second, and third. Just like that. Now, you want to go back to auto mode, flip your switch on the fly when you're driving, no matter what, boom. There you go. Pretty simple. So that was the factory shifter mode. Now let's wire up that overdrive, and we're actually going to make use of this switch so that you can see how the overdrive mode works. So let's wire that up real quick. Okay, so if you aren't using this for anything external, you can just wrap this all up with the controller, or you can even trim it short and do what you need with it. So for us, we have our purple and our white twisted together over here. So the white is the switch out, and the purple is 4th gear in. But on this mode, it's called overdrive. So now, let's go back to this and see what happens. Alright, so we remember before how we had 3, 2, and 1 as our options. So now, this switch is connected to our overdrive mode. So what this does is it raises every single gear by 1. So now, in the same position, we have 2, 3, and 4. So you can have them. And you don't have to use it all the time, like you can just flip between 3 and 4 in drive, or the other thing is, if you want to come down here, you can flip between 1 and 2 while you're in first, second. So this could be a pretty useful off-road mode if you want to leave the shifter where it's at and just go, hey, I need first or I need second. The cool thing about this is, in first and second, we still have engine braking in both of these. First and second engine braking. So we can kind of flip back and forth and still have that. So you can kind of do like a pseudo-electric approach like that and still keep your stuff. So that is the overdrive mode if you would like to be able to flip around the gears a little bit or do something like that. So that is overdrive mode. Same thing if you wanted to wire this to be your manual mode switch. If you don't want the power comfort, you don't have the power comfort, stuff like that, you can wire this into your manual switch, and then this is your manual on and off. So this thing can be used for whatever you want. If you don't want overdrive, you can also do the torque converter. So let me show you that real quick. That is the orange wire. So let's do that. Okay. So now, that's a torque converter. On and off, just like that. And that is our white wire and our orange wire together. So like I said, all that you're looking for when you're trying to figure this out, it's not super complicated, I promise. Inputs are what go in, and outputs are what come out. So their switch is an output, 12 volts is considered an output. So you just wire, you're putting 12 volts into any of these inputs and that turns them on. So there you go. So there's the torque converter mode. And so right now we're in auto mode. Torque converter doesn't work. If you flip that other switch, the torque converter switch, then it will work in auto mode or manual. So that could be an interesting, like, semi-manual mode. If you want to have more control over the torque converter on the highway, you can wire that up like that as well and hit that switch. So you can change the torque converter, but it'll still shift all the gears for you automatically. So that could be an interesting mode if that tickles your fancy. But that's pretty much everything for the factory shifter mode in a nutshell. All your engine braking, all your gear shifting, and everything else in between. But what if you want to get more fancy? Or say you have a Rad Designs rail shifter. This also supports the rail shifter. Didn't know that, did you? That was one of the fun additions of the v1.1. Okay, so we're going to flip this bad boy over and we're going to check out the custom shifter mode. So we're going to wire this in a traditional 4-way setup. So for that, I just have this joystick, which will go 4 directions. You can use other things. And you guys that have ever been to an arcade, ever played Cruisin' USA, where they got that nice ka-chunk 4-way shifter, that'll work with this. Any kind of switches or anything will work. So you could even sit there and use 4 switches or buttons or anything. Anything you can think of that you can wire up, this thing will work with. So we got this little cluster of wiring going on just to show you guys, but all that it really is just the 4 inputs. So we wired 12 volts to what's called common. That doesn't always mean ground. So for these 4 wires, you'd have to trace out and figure out what they all do, but we have 4 different positions, and the black one is common. What that means is all the buttons are connected to this on one side, and on the other side is the thing. So the way that this works is each one of these switches or buttons or whatever you want to say, this is the part that you can see, the colored wire, and the common is this one. So we were going to wire 12 volts to our common. So we follow our black wire, that goes to red for our 12 volts. So 12 volt goes into every single switch. And then when you close the gap, 12 volts now goes to that particular gear. So you have all 4. The way I have it wired to show you guys is 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so that's our manual 4-way. Now we just got to crawl into here, and we flip our shifter from factory to 4-way. So it's the first switch, and that's going to the left for the unit. Okay, so that's all that. So, power comfort is still being retained for our manual mode, just to show you guys. So, let's see what it looks like. The keen among you guys will notice that gears 1 through 4 say latching. Now what this means is, you can push the button to activate it, and you can let go, and it'll hold the gear for you. Now that is useful for momentary style, things like this, where you have to hold it down. When you let go, it remembers the last gear that was pushed. So it's got a little bit of a memory to it. That's also useful for, big ka-chunk shifters. Say you're going from first to second. In between those gears is free space. It's just floating around. There's no gear. You don't want it to just drop into fourth. So when you're going from first to second, you hit first, it remembers first. You're out of a button, still in first. Then we hit second, and it switches to second. So that's useful for all kinds of different purposes. So, let me show you. So we're going to go into manual mode right here, and it's in fourth. And then we'll take our joystick, and we'll push this forward, and we're in first, and I let go, and it's still in first. Second, third, fourth, first, third, second, fourth. Tell me that's not freaking cool. You can do the same thing with 4 buttons. You can have 1, 2, 3, 4, however you want it. A switch like this. Hey, first gear. Things like that. So that is our 4-way shifter mode like that with the latching memory. Now, the only thing that does not latch is torque converter. Torque converter will have to be on a flip switch like this. When you let go, it turns off. It's just like, because how would it know to turn the torque converter off, But that is our 4-way mode that you can use buttons or joysticks or switches or things like that. But wait, there's more. now we're going to get onto some of the more fancy stuff for the gearbox, custom mode. So, say for instance you don't have the power comfort switch. I know a lot of you guys don't have it, or you don't want to use it. Okay, fine. So now we wire this up, and now this is going to be our manual mode, right? So now we have manual on and off. But say you don't need all this. Okay, you don't care about having all the gears and all this crazy stuff. You just want something simple, right? You just want to be like, hey, I want to throw this bad boy in first, and if I want second, I want to push a button. And if I don't want second, then leave it in auto. I don't want all this fancy herba-derba blah blah blah. Okay. So it might be a bit much to ask you to switch to manual and then also input your second gear so that you're in second. That's 2 button presses. Say for instance you want a third or something, you'd have to push third and go back and forth, and that's, you could kind of turn on and off like that once it's set, but maybe that's a bit too much for you. Well, we have a mode down here for the manual override output. So what we're going to do, right now our switch is wired to brown, but maybe we don't want that. So we're going to take our gray wire instead, and we're going to wire the gray wire to brown. Now this gets rid of latching, but what it does is it makes your gear button multifunctional. So when you switch into a gear, it also switches manual mode at the same time. So one switch does 2 functions. So I'll wire this up real quick and show you what that looks like. So finally we can look at the one-man jam. So the way that this works is gray goes to brown, so override goes into manual in, and now we have our switch just tied to a gear. For instance, I'm going to pick 2. So the way that this works now, this switch is doing 2 things. This switch goes into second, but as it's going into second, that override is also turning manual on. So this is instant gear. So you want like a gear lockout. So hey, I want second gear no matter what. Okay, you got second gear. Turn it off, hey, you're back into auto. Whatever the transmission was doing before, it's doing again. Second manual, auto. Just like that. And you're not limited to just one switch. Say you wire up another switch, okay? So now we got one down here, and this one will do third. Okay. So when we hold that on, we're in manual, and we're in third. Now, don't get too confused. This light only turns on when this switch turns on. And it backfeeds. So if this was tied to manual, then it would turn on. That's one of the downfalls of this switch, is the switch and the light are tied together. So whatever the switch does, the light does. So this is only the gear. This is second gear, but manual is being controlled by that override. So when we do this, the light doesn't come on because it's not manual, that's second. But see what's going on here? When we hold this down, it's not latching, but hey, you got third gear, and now you're back to auto. Fourth gear, back to manual. You can't tell, but 1, manual. And same with second. So see how that light came on? Because second is tied together. But yeah, this is like a semi-manual mode. So as long as the button's being pressed, boom. Same with the switch, boom. So that's a really quick and dirty way if you just want like a simple on-off solution that gets rid of a switch. So yeah, that's pretty much everything right there. I'll pull it out so you can see how the how a rad controller would get connected. But yeah, that's pretty much the Nifty Shifter in a nutshell right there. How the display works, some of the different modes, and some of the overrides and interesting ways that we can use this thing. So like I said, it's all laid out here. But that's the Junior. I tried to keep it simple, but still give you tons of options so you can make this exactly the way you want. Switch or something down here, or, you know, wherever you think you could mount it. But like I said, this is manual only. There's no sequential, there's no auto, there's no fancy stuff. It's just manual. That's what the Junior does. I will be working on a Pro model eventually, hopefully, and that'll do programmable stuff. That'll be later. That'll be like mid to late 2020, and that should be some fun stuff. So stay tuned for that. And while I still got your attention, in case you wanted to see the screen, this is the gauge pod frame. So these are just press fit. It's a pretty tight fit. This ain't coming out easily. You'd have to really press on that. But these things just push into a standard 52mm gauge pod. Let me switch hands here. So the fun thing is that the case itself, like the square size of it, is actually the same size. So you don't even need the ring. The ring's really just to make it look pretty. But yeah, if you want a gauge pod gear shift, I think that looks pretty clean. especially for 3D printing, trying to get this ring and all that raised edge and stuff, and yeah, that's fun. But yeah, gauge pod stuff, we got you covered. Pretty cool. Okay, just a quick addition for those of you guys with the Rad Designs rail shifter over here. This is what that looks like. It's got 3 wires. You have your power in and your 2 switch outputs. So that will work with this guy, but we'll have to adjust these shift jumpers down here. So there's actually 3 pins there, and you've got normal and direct. So add a comment to your order if you need direct instead of normal, but you just take a soldering iron in there and swoop those up and solder those. They're solder jumpers. It's a little you know, intimidating if you haven't used a soldering iron or you're not really good with it. So just let me know and I'll happily change the jumpers for you. So when it's set to direct mode, then you will wire the first one. Wick me here. You'll wire the first one to gear 1 and the second one to gear 2, and then you'll have all 4 gears with that. Now, why would you want to do this? This takes care of all the wiring, so you don't have to cut in your wiring. You have manual on and off at the flip of the switch, and all the load resistive stuff that keeps the check engine light off. All that still works with you. You also got torque converter if you add a switch. So they play together really nicely, is what I'm saying. You know, if you want to get one of these guys as your joystick, you can wire it into this, and this will do all the hard part, all the switching, all the load stuff for you. And hey, you even get a display out of it too, so tell me that ain't swanky. Anyway, that is the Nifty Shifter Jr. version 1.1. Let me know what you think. Nick and Time Design out, son.